In 1994, as I said, I was in first year university and got to work with some wonderful people at UTS. Probably the best person I worked with was in my final year of study, Professor Jennifer Edwards. And Jenny really let me loose. I said, Jenny, I want to do a research sort of project on government identifiers and the microchipping of human beings. And in her very, very much pure computer science way, said, oh yeah, whatever you want, Kat, you can do it. So I would see her once a week, drive 1.5 hours to see her, and we would sit in her office. She was a professor, quite young, and just talk about the topic. Very encouraging. And that degree had 2 cooperative semesters, one of them at Otis Elevator Company, the other one at Anderson Consulting. And while I was finishing my project, I was also at Anderson Consulting, and I was allowed to use the corporate library, which was a wonderful, wonderful transnational library, most of it in print, but a lot of it accessed online as well. And I came across a piece. The librarian was very helpful. I explained to her what my thesis was about, and she came back with something. And that something was called the human metaphor. And I believe on the pages that I photocopied, painstakingly, I must have spent days photocopying things like information on automatic teller machines and point of sale and all of these other things. I came across the human metaphor. And in my mind, the depiction was of something that you see below in the screen there. It was a human being with their hands on a table with a cathode road tube on their head. And I remember going home to Michael and saying, Michael, you would never believe what I just read today and what I saw. It's exactly what you've been talking about. But lo and behold, Überveillance in concept was an old thing, I think, that Michael had in his heart, but had not been articulated. And never did we think, Michael being a theologian and philosopher, did we ever think we'd actually end up researching together? And we did, which was magical, actually, around 2003. We just never thought computer science, and then later myself in law, and then Michael in philosophy, history, theology, counseling, and so many other sort of literature, government. We never thought we'd actually end up working together, but we did. And we got to teach many classes together, which was a joy. And we actually even got to lecture some on occasion together. But by the end of my degree, I ended up becoming employed by a company called Nortel, Northern Telecom, the first company to build PABXs in the world. And to cut a long story short, I left Sydney with many job offers, and we moved down to the Illawarra together. And I never was looking for work. But one weekend, I was with my father-in-law in Sydney. We were up visiting, and he always loved the Sydney Morning Herald. And I turned to the second page, and there was this big spread saying network planner, network planners needed, whatever that was. And it said University of Wollongong. And I thought, this can't be right. Like the place where I'm doing my master's at the time would also be my place of work.
You mean your PhD?
Well, I upgraded. So I started in a master's by research and then upgraded halfway through that in 1998 to finish the PhD. So there I was working for a multinational company. I was doing research on implantables. And I went to my tote tray in 1998 because back then the company had newspapers in print. They were about 35 to 40 pages in size. And on the back page, I had let it fester there on my desk for a few weeks. And then on the back page, I just turned, as you do, to the back, and I saw Cyborg 1.0, you know, Nortel sponsors this project. And I had heard around the traps that the humble phone that we produced at the time was quite a nice phone, actually, compared to the bricks that were around in 1998, would become obsolete. And they were already talking to us about brain-to-brain interfaces, that this was already obsolete technology, despite that Nortel had one of the trendiest kinds of mobile phones. So there I was at Anderson Consulting. I get hit with this human metaphor. I turn up to like my first couple of years at Nortel, where I'm building networks across the world, really, predominantly in Asia, but also elsewhere. You know, cutting edge stuff on storage area networks. And on the back page is my company sponsoring a guy, a professor from the University of Reading, a cyberneticist who wants to implant himself in an experiment, who ends up becoming a lifelong friend, Kevin Warwick. So this is actually the photocopy. Last night, I didn't sleep. I wanted to find the photocopies. And I've digitized most of my materials, but this is what it looked like. So imagine I think I was 20 years old. We had been married not even 2 years, 3 years. And we had been talking a lot about our work, of course, and our studies. But the human metaphor, moving to the end of technology. Think about that. And then the trends were this. There is only one important trend, the human metaphor. The drive to eliminate the human-computer interface, HCI. And then I kept reading on. The metaphor for the computer will be the human being. Hang on a second. The metaphor for the computer will be the human being. What? I think that's a bit like the H+ transhumanist kinds of definitions. Human-to-computer communications as natural as human-to-human communications. And the end of the computer interface. That means we become the Borg. We assimilate, we somehow coalesce with a machine. Meanwhile, I'm studying implantables for my PhD. And at that time, I was working in my last year of university, ready to matriculate to go into permanent work. So we started with batch systems in the 60s, went online in the 70s, had database management system integration in the 80s, and then they called the 1990s, which is what I was living in when I was at this workplace, the new age. And the new age was the human-computer metaphor, the elimination of the requirement for HCI, the natural interaction with machines, as if we weren't talking to machines, we were one with machines. And I think this concept we had talked about as the electrophorus together, which was published in my thesis, but I can say that Michael had a big deal to have with that definition and its exploration. And so there was the man with the cathode ray tube. It's actually an iMac. I also worked in work experience for Apple Mac in the city when I was in grade 10. But you can see this woman is talking to this man, but the man has, an iMac on his head, and she's like, everything's normal. Like everything is normal. This is the new age system. Now, whether this is a metaphor or the people who created this actually believed we will become one with a machine, I'm not sure. But the implications were identified. The end of the computer interface, technology so sophisticated it cannot be seen. Okay, so there's that ubiquity, there's that this invisibility, this unobtrusiveness, this covertness, this one with, this ambience, this ambient intelligence. And so then the stories get deeper and deeper. Eduardo Katz creates in 1997 a bioartistry where he implants himself and puts something in his leg. You can see the implant there. It's a transponder that Michael was describing before. And he proceeds to register himself on a pet database. And he claims in his work, which you can find online still today, that it's not that phones are extensions of humans, but we are extensions of the machines. That's what he claims. And so there I am working, creating networks across Asia, huge wide area networks, using mapping intelligence information, using know-how of our systems at Nortel, and working with people in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in India, in Taiwan, and many of these places I got to visit, the Philippines. They were all deregulating. And so we were just milking, if I could say at the time, the ability to share infrastructure with regards to bandwidth. Everyone wanted more bandwidth. This was the time, at this time that I was working there, we're talking about 14 kilobits per second speed. And then there were hints of the 1 meg modem, and then wireless and wireless broadband. And then we went from 2G to 3G, and then we were auctioning off, while I was still there in 2002, auctioning off 3G network space and spectrum across Australia, for example. And here's that infamous, so that was 97, 98 right here. And you can see on the back page here, October 1998, there's that article. And there were many subsequent articles. I just can't find them. So it says here, Kevin Warwick, head of the cybernetics department at the University of Reading, recently spent several days as the world's first cyborg. Warwick, an expert on robotics and intelligent buildings, had a tiny glass capsule containing an electromagnetic coil and several silicon chips capable of transmitting a 64-bit signal surgically implanted in his arm. His secretary commented, "It was often hard to find Professor Warwick, but since the implant, we always know where he is." That's because they rigged up the hallways with RFID readers. Warwick told Nortel World his goal is to connect to the nervous system next and ultimately use thought processes to operate computers. In fact, the company took that as possible and sponsored one of Kevin Warwick's students, Mark Gasson, who you saw at the beginning of the PowerPoint slide. So there's Professor Kevin Warwick undergoing his first procedure. He only kept the implant in for 10 days. This is Dr. George Boulos, who agreed to do the operation. We then had this wonderful CEO who both raised us and sunk us, but you can see here the share price. If we think Google was big, at the time I was at Nortel, I think I was receiving hundreds of shares in lieu of my work, and the share price was rising from when I joined to, from say $10 or $4, we're talking now 100 plus. This was unheard of around the time of the dot-com crash. This is what we describe as the dot-com crash, but many of the organizations were happy in purchasing companies, and I talk about this.
I think you should mention, consequently, the shares meant nothing.
They meant nothing.
Yeah, right.
We'll talk about that in a moment.
Right,
This is the thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That while they were busy, we bought Shasta Networks for 340 million, and this is now 2000. Right? It's not 340 million in 2020. So these are commensurately worth billions. Qterra, a fiber optic regenerator company, 3.25 billion, etc., not to go on the sums. But as we grew quickly, we bought out a lot of infrastructure and a lot of competitors. We merged with competitors, and we had a lot of superfluous product, which sent the company into a spin. So on the one hand, buying, we increased our workforce from 30,000 people to 130,000, which is where sort of your typical Google is at today. But we did that back in 2000, and then the big crash. But their eyes were not on innovations to do with pick up the telephone and have a voice call on a 64 kilobit line. No, they were thinking brain to brain. John Roth would often write to his employees directly, one of these charismatic CEOs who would reach out transnationally to 150 countries and basically say, look, this is my vision. We're doing a right angle turn. Everything's going to be IP. Everything's going to be data. And so while I'm working at Nortel and enrolled in my PhD, it's 2001 by now, and I read about this digital angel thing. This wireless service transmits medical information from patient to doctor. And AT&T, which is the big incumbent operator like Telstra in the States, says we're going to go for it, AT&T Wireless. And at that time in 2002, Kevin goes one step further and does Cyborg 2.0. This is wife Irina, and wife Irina has an implant, and Kevin places an electrode into the median nerve. And as he's clenching his fist or moving his thumb and forefinger, he's starting to do things remotely. His wife believes that she felt Morse code coming through in a blind test case in the laboratory at Kevin's lab. And there were many observers there. I've met both of them. I've had dinner with both of them. And they seem very interesting people with regards to where robotics will go into the future and how humans will utilize technologies embedded in the body. But back to the digital angel now. So all of these things are happening. I'm telling you this story chronologically. So the digital angel introduces the ability to allow someone that you love to be watched and location tracked in case they may have dementia and are wandering. The system works by you wearing a watch at first, then digital angel changed to be an implantable device. But if the wearer has an ambient temperature alert, an emergency fall down alert, or a wander alert outside a geofence boundary, a cell tower is notified that the person is out of bounds or has had a forced hit on the ground. The operations center is notified, the caregiver is notified by the operations center, and someone can come to the aid of the individual. 2002, I want to put you in perspective. WAP was around in 2002. The wireless access protocol on the phones. It was like 1.5G, not even fully 2G. And they were thinking about digital angels at the time. But of course, I was working for a networks company. So all of this seemed quite logical to me as I studied at my workplace, both GSM and then later UMTS protocols. And then, as we saw, beyond those, intelligence services. Let's have a look at what was happening in the patent world. And I know, Joe Carvalko, you'll be interested. But in 2002, patents were being identified for transponder implants, a passive integrated transponder called a PIT tag, interestingly enough, comprising an integrated circuit and a unitary core is described furthermore in the patent. We then saw VeryChip come out and fully say, we can identify, we can locate, and we can protect. Few people believe that RFID implants for people were actually available around 2002, 2003, 2004. In fact, Applied Digital Solutions was on the New York Stock Exchange around about 2004. And many people can't even conceive that implantables were around before even 2G mobiles were around, right? But such was the core. And if I show you this snap, and I'm very glad I took these snaps, you can go to the Wayback Machine on archive.org and also find these kinds of prints, but I took these during the writing of my thesis. There was the Get Chip campaign. This is the transponder on the left. We now have tags as different form factors, but they said $50 off to all ADSX stockholders of record will receive a $50 discount at the time of chipping, or the first 100,000 registrants. This is how many people they thought would just mop up and attend and adopt in order to get some savings. And so this is a small commercial that I want to share with you, only 30 seconds, so that you can see the kinds of things that were being conceived in the early 2000s.
To think something so small can connect you to everything that matters.
When your life and all you love are on the line.
Elflink is always with you when every second counts in the emergency room, providing immediate access to your medical records.
Because Bob has trouble remembering all his medications.
Because I'm in love with my kids' kids.
Because my car lost control while driving.
Because now I'm looking out for both of us.
Because I have diabetes, but it doesn't have me.
Because I spend my life in the ER trying to save yours.
So friends, Applied Digital Solutions morphed into VeryChip. VeryChip diversified into 4 areas, according to the website at the time. You can't find that website apart from the Wayback Machine today. They had the VeryPay. They were thinking about implantable solutions for payment instead of using a card. The VeryGuard, physical access control to premises. Correctional services, so basically to implant inmates, perhaps individuals serving their sentence from home instead of using an anklet bracelet. And the VeryMed, this doctor to nurse to patient kind of transference using implantables. And the VeryMed would act as a personal health record, a PHR. And that PHR would store things like your allergies, would store your current doses of drugs, and would store any condition that you may have had. For example, if you're an anaphylactic. This is Jeff and Derek and Leslie Jacobs. Jeff suffered from Huntington disease. Wife Leslie was fine, and young man Derek was Microsoft certified by the age of 13 or 14. He loved technology, and this is the scanner that was used at the time. The VeryChip was ordered or recommended to be placed on the right tricep, but not everyone agreed to that. But the definitions in the company's papers were actually about the right tricep, which later many users said was, impossible to actually flex your arm. It was much handier to be in the hand itself because you could reach out rather than try to wiggle your arm or shoulder towards a reader, especially a reader that was fixed and not mobile. So this is actually the VeryChip reader. It's a mobile device. 900 hospitals had invested in the device. Ambulances were supposed to stock them for those 900 hospitals that had registered on the schema, because when they reached a patient, and if the patient was incapacitated, the reader device would be scanned on the right tricep where the implant was to be assumed had been implanted, and would tell the individual and link up allegedly. But you need people to adopt, you need readers to become distributed and out there. The young man actually deceased in a motorbike accident, young Derek Jacobs, which was a shock to most people as he was very much promoted in this implantable ideal. Baja Beach Club then, a chain of a Baja Beach Club chain in Rotterdam, in Barcelona, and also one in America, adopted the Applied Digital Solution mobile reader. Here we can see the person being scanned in. I met the gentleman, Serafim Villaplana, in Barcelona in 2009. I actually went in here. These are my photos. And it was a really strange feeling to actually go into that nightclub. Serafim, who was not a university trained, created a database and a payment system so that VIP customers, and there were around about purportedly 200 to 300 VIP customers, some say 400. They didn't really keep tabs, but you could load some money onto the implant and then go into different VIP zones as you frequented the beach. And the whole idea was, while you were partying and not wearing very much, you know, in Barcelona, they usually wear their swimsuits in these kinds of establishments. You could go from the beach into the cafe, into the restaurant, into the VIP zone, into the drinking zone, and so forth, and come in and out without needing to carry keys, without needing to carry money. That was the whole idea. And when you looked at the guidebook, one of the guidebooks had, you know, you must go and visit Baja Beach Club. And interestingly enough, I didn't seek out this club. I was at a conference, in a women in engineering conference, just having left Mark Gasson and Kevin Warwick in England at another conference on identity systems. And someone on the bus who was taking care of the delegates heard me talking about my research to someone next to me and said, oh, my best friend's boyfriend is the guy you're talking about. And it's like, what? She goes, when are you leaving? I can organize an interview. I said, what? And of course, me with my suitcases, there are other photos of me. Literally, I felt like I was descending the pits of hell. It was very interesting because they were making up Baja. It was going to be called the Opium Club. But it was a very strange feeling, thinking I've got my luggage and I'm probably never going to get out of here. But no, the gentlemen downstairs in the pit, we went to a physical strong room, were very welcoming. I had a translator with me from the Spanish, and we spoke deeply about this. And he said it was a gimmick, although his reasoning was in the future, most of us would be carrying implants. Then I come into contact with a gentleman, citywatcher.com. Michael and I were at school, probably at university. You had probably finished a lecture with that class. And I get a call out of the blue in 2009 by Mr. Gary Rutherford, who has remained a lifelong friend, a consultant who worked for Applied Digital Solutions, who was installing implantables because the guy he was working for, Sean Darks, kept losing his card. And so he said to Sean, I know what we can do. We can introduce implants into this video surveillance for the city of Ohio and Cincinnati locale. And actually Sean Darks got an implant, and you can see he's now using his forearm, not even his tricep at this stage. And as we see this time, it's gradually going from the tricep down to the forearm to the thumb and webbing of the thumb and forefinger. And there's the strong room that had physical access control. Only a few people were allowed to go in there because there was sensitive information. But at one stage, they actually thought they would need that many buses, that the buses would become mobile chipping vans, that people would be walking up at the side street and saying, I've got diabetes, I want a VeryChip because it's a great idea as a personal health record. They also thought, and the first place they did this, for those who are listening from Maryland, was around the Maryland area. We then started to see an underground emergence of the tag, these biohackers. I remember seeing this from my office at Nortel Networks one lunchtime when I was doing some research for university. And there were a group of members, and we're talking now in the hundreds, who were sharing things. This is 2005, who were sharing about their biohacks, what they got to do with their latest devices. And I saw a gentleman here by the name of Emil. And I reached out to Emil and interviewed Emil. So all of these people in this order, in this sequence, in this beautiful sequence, and this one happenstance after another. Here, Emil is interviewed by IEEE Spectrum, and lo and behold, many of you met Christine Paraxlis last week. She wrote a paper with the late Robert Walk on implantables, one of the first surveys launched, I would say the first survey launched on national security and implantables in the US. And she got to critique the article along with others and myself. So it was very interesting, our introduction to Emil, and then I ran a full-length interview with Emil. We also co-authored many papers together, and he also came to ISTAS 2010 to talk about his biohacking. He's now the entrepreneur of dangerousthings.com. But again, going back to the patents, 2007 now, skin marking for indicating subdermal chips. So you might have an implant, but how does somebody else know you've got an implant? So there was a patent to identify implants. There were different visualizations of implantables or wearables, but mainly implantables using RFID, of how you would interact with your house and a wide area network. So if you wanted ambient intelligence, how could you do that successfully? And you can look up these patents now, they're available. And here we are, three of these gentlemen, or two of them in this picture, Emil himself and Marc Gasson with the implants, Professor Raphael Capura, the ethicist who came from Germany to describe Überveillance for us in his own words and describe the perils. He was also part of the European Commission on ICT implants, and Roger Clark, of course, the author of Dataveillance, and he was our conference chair, Michael. But with all of these inventions and innovations, the practice actually infiltrates into society. If I said to you, I received one of these every second day, these are emails from people who believe they've been implanted forcibly. This person says, I'm investigating the unsolicited use of ICT technology. I have an implant myself with controllers being idiotic, including damaging and communicating. Can I ask you about your ICT implants research, please? I'm looking for doctors and possibly a lawyer to deal with the unsolicited use of ICT technology in Australia. Do you have any connections in this regard who are able to discuss in this regard? Now, I could show you literally over 100 that I've saved, and I've not been careful to save the early ones, but there is a crisis at the moment of people believing they have been implanted against their will. In fact, some individuals have even taken to neuroscience degrees while they believe they've been forcibly implanted. Laws were introduced in the States for identification devices and subcutaneous implanting. And there are many different states. I won't hover on each one of these. I'll make these slides available through Joe, but you can see a comparison done by one of our research students in that class of Michael's, comparing California, Colorado, Florida, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, and so forth, and who had the right or who didn't have the right to implant, what were some of the fines being stipulated in those bills and laws, and how many consecutive days would those fines be executed for. Again, more patents, patents for GPS implants, and this is something new we haven't heard of before, right? Around 2010. So really GPS doesn't work well because of the blood and water barrier in the body and the skin. But now we're starting to look at innovations where GPS implants are being embraced. Location-based GPS implants. Then companies like Autodesk experimenting with tap sensors and tactile buttons and implantables of a different nature, not so much to read your physical characteristics, but to allow you to input something beneath the skin. We've seen other patents from outside the US talk about microchipping humans and animals using GPS, for example. Another design here from another patent, and all of these are sourced in the notes. You'll see hundreds of these. So every time someone conceives of an idea for a body area network, they're conceiving of an RFID device or an NFC device, either worn, inserted, or implanted into the human being. And so the creation of the body area network standard by IEEE was around about 2011. So we're seeing this progression over time, the creation of the transponder, the demonstration that it does work, the growth of the mobile broadband network infrastructure, the potential for a standard on the human body, and then the interaction between all of these different components in a network, an end-to-end network. And so then we have NIST coming on board saying, yeah, we better be privy about this band thing, this body area network thing, because different countries have different frequencies where they embrace different standards, whether it's the mixed standards, the WMTS, the ISM, the ultra wideband in their megahertz ranges. And so in 2011, there were discussions even about the propagation delay. If we placed a device, a hub device, into the human body, where should it be based to allow for the least amount of backscatter so signal strength could be strong and captured? But the tummy is not the best place, actually. So in 2012, we gave a TEDx talk. We looked at the timeline to that day and then progressed further. Where are we going? Is it going to be not just iTunes and iPods and iLife and iPads? Is it going to be an iPlant? And most likely in 2013, where Joe was present, Christine Paraxis, and so many more, we talked about the wearables going through their phases from phase 1 to phase 2 and generation from generation, way beyond Google Glass. Steve Mann had created the iTap device that even had depth perception many years before Google Glass. And then we had even companies like Medtronic saying, well, why consider implants for sick people? Everyone should have one of these sensors. It's the size of a AAA battery. This could save your life. And IEEE Spectrum ran a story on that. We then had Andreas Sjöström from Sweden, who's now in San Francisco. He spoke at our ISTAS last week and called microchip implants a pretty bad idea, although that didn't stop him from testing the idea for an air flight between Stockholm and Paris. And it did work. You know, he put his hand against the reader, he boarded the flight. It was a bit of a mimic and a gimmick, but he had a lot of things to say about what kind of problem do implants solve. And he said it doesn't really solve a real problem. It doesn't really work well. Sometimes you need to scan multiple times. Depending on the implantable, sometimes if you didn't carry a biobond, the implant would also go from the top of your tricep right down to somewhere else on your body. In fact, many animals have been recovered in the world after being lost, and they can't find the implant because it's traveled through the skin and transdermal layer of the skin. 3 square market, more implanting. I got chipped, more gimmicks. You know, for vending machines. 3 square market was a vending machine company. We then went to multi-application through your implant. Why just use it for vending or for payment or for VeryPay? You can use it for passports. You can use it for your keys to turn on your car. You can use it for your front door access, your worker access, your access to your computer, your access to your mobile phone, right? So we're starting to diversify here with IoT. And now currently in some small case studies, although I will say to you, we're talking now in the thousands, SG Rail, public rail service does allow for people, VIP customers, to top up their implant with money to pay for their fare. And that is now in the thousands. But it's not like 1 million people tomorrow will take this. But what we're seeing is perhaps companies that are coming to talk about this. So DangerousThings.com has been around since 2009. We believe biohacking is the next phase of human evolution, a bit like the human metaphor that we read about at Anderson Consulting. The Internet of Us is Biohacks International, a very famous company that does a lot of the microchipping parties in Sweden. Biotech, another human re-engineering company that really looks at implantables, like book your implant, buy online. Chip My Life, an Australian company from Glebe, run by Steve Stevens and his wife. Biohacking and BioWell, who are looking at supporting people in wheelchairs so that they are able to be more mobile through the use of implantables, for example, to open their front door. And so we're seeing this overlay of surveillance, of technology speak, of actual product, the actual medical device and how well it works and how it's implanted and how people feel about it and in the future. But what inspired all of this? Where did these ideas at Anderson come from? A very interesting executive, perhaps, a young intern. Who and why? And so we go back with Michael very often to science fiction. And here we have Casino Royale from 2006, where James receives an implant device and allows him to be, in some parts, superhuman. We go back to The Entire History of You, a Black Mirror episode from 2011, where the implant is behind the head in what's called the grain. And the grain allows you to see through your eyes and replay events that have happened in the past. We can go back even to Johnny Mnemonic in 1995 with this thing on his head and this transference, this implant scene of how this memory is downloaded to Johnny. We can even go to The Surrogates with Bruce Willis, look at the brain puppeteers. Or we can go frightening back to George Lucas with THX 1138. But look at this picture here with THX 1138.
38, yeah.
And then look at the next slide with the Neuralink. That's how far we've come. We were just talking about implants for the body for the greater part of this talk, but now we're actually transferring through the brain. Well, what about the Neuralink? What about the brain implant? And what's that about? I think I'll probably say maybe it's about, a lot to do with the mind. but really no one will ever know what you're thinking. They may know how the synapses are firing between locations in the brain, but they won't know your thoughts. So